On our broadcast tonight, what a sight here in New York today, led by President Obama, offering a big challenge to an audience, including some interesting characters. The red storm that took place today that had some people wondering if their city was on fire. Keep the change. Some big banks have agreed to back down on those hefty overdraft fees we exposed, but is it too little too late? And the sting, the young video avenger behind the spoof that has blown the political lid off the Acorn organization, and how he got his start in pictures. Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. President Obama wanted to sound different today, and he did. No U.S. president has given quite the speech he did today before the UN General Assembly here in New York. It can also be said that no one has looked out on an audience quite so unusual. It is where we begin here tonight with NBC's Andrea Mitchell across town at the UN tonight. Andrea, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. It was the president's first speech to the United Nations, and it marked a very stark departure from the policies of George W. Bush, as the president called for a new era of engagement with the rest of the world, reaching out to new friends and old foes. President Obama was welcomed to the world stage, along with a rogues gallery of longtime international pariahs. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi back at the UN for the first time in 40 years. Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. President Obama's message was that the U.S. is no longer going it alone, but his challenge to critics was blunt.
Those who used to chastise America for acting alone in the world cannot now stand by and wait for America to solve the world's problems alone.
Ahmadinejad made a show of looking bored, but the president was cheered for his decision to close Guantanamo and stop abusive interrogations.
I prohibited, without exception or equivocation, the use of torture by the United States of America.
He showed his impatience with endless foot-dragging by both sides in the Middle East and warned North Korea and Iran against escalating the nuclear arms race.
They must be held accountable.
Mr. Obama and his team then made a quick exit, moving on to a series of events.
All right, let's see where I am. Does anybody know where I am?
Steering clear of the next speaker.
His Excellency Muammar Gaddafi, leader of the revolution, president of the African Union, king of kings of the traditional kings of Africa.
Gaddafi raged on for 95 minutes and 8 seconds, a diatribe against the UN from a jumble of handwritten notes, waving a copy of the UN Charter, then pretending to rip it up.
It should not be called the Security Council. It should be called the Terror Council.
But he only had praise for Mr. Obama, whom he called our son.
We are happy if Obama can stay forever as President of America.
He made no mention of the Libyan bombing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, but launched a bizarre harangue about the assassination of President Kennedy.
We want to know who killed him. Somebody by the name of Lee Harvey. And then another, Jack Ruby, killed Lee Harvey. Why did he kill him?
Mystifying the UN and the White House.
If I were to try to begin to explain the actions of Mr. Gaddafi today, I might be busy the better part of the remainder of the afternoon.
Tonight, Iran's president is addressing the United Nations, but the president was already safely across town hosting a reception for UN delegates. But he did vow today to continue negotiations with Iran on the nuclear issue, and he picked up the possibility of important support for the first time from Russia to consider sanctioning Iran if Iran does not comply. Brian?
Andrea Mitchell across town at the UN starting us off tonight. Andrea, thanks. We've seen there's kind of a circus atmosphere inside the UN, but the fact is the stakes are high. Our chief White House correspondent, political director Chuck Todd here in New York, while the president's in New York to brief us on more about that. And Chuck, for a while it did look like the bar scene in Star Wars, except that the stakes are so high. And while the president spoke, you know, he's got other issues simmering. Take them one at a time. Afghanistan and health care.
Well, let's start with Afghanistan. This has been a very public debate. Had a couple of veteran watchers of the military tell me not since Vietnam have we seen this sort of public debate between the White House and the Pentagon. Now, the White House will say, hey, this is what President Obama campaigned on. He was going to have robust debates. This is what he likes. Nobody likes it to be this public. That said, you have General McChrystal doing interviews with the New York Times, doing interviews with others. You have General Petraeus, who's going to be in charge of deciding strategy, doing a speech at the press club. So we're hearing all about this. Now, in the actual policy, the White House does remind us that General McChrystal wrote his report before the results of the Afghanistan elections.
First time we've heard it, but an important point to them.
It is a very important point, and their argument is going to be this. Things have changed, and the elections, if we don't have a stable partner, then we have to have a new strategy.
And quickly, we've been off of it for about 2 days. Where is health care?
We know this. The real Senate Majority Leader is Republican Senator Olympia Snowe. She wants more information from the Congressional Budget Office, and that means we will not see a health care bill out of that Senate Finance Committee at the soonest till next Tuesday, even though the White House was hoping they might actually get it tomorrow.
A lot of this bill being tinkered for the approval of just one Republican senator from Maine. Chuck Todd, as always, thanks. A little later in this broadcast, part of my interview with the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown earlier today about his time with President Obama in the States and this recent strain over the release of the man who brought down Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. Now we turn to the unbelievable sight today in one of the most startlingly beautiful cities in the world. You're about to see why some people initially thought their city was on fire. It was not fire, but something very unusual is going on in Sydney, Australia. Our own Ian Williams reports.
Australians woke this morning to an apocalyptic vision. Sydney blanketed in a red fog of dust, swept in from the outback. The Opera House an eerie smudge. The city's iconic harbour bridge had all but disappeared. This is what it usually looks like. The storm seen in this satellite photo blowing 5 million tonnes of dust over much of Australia's eastern coast. Flights were diverted, ferries suspended. There were urgent health warnings as air pollution levels went off the charts. Emergency services treated a flood of patients.
It's been unbelievable. From nearly the crack of dawn, we've had joggers come in, fit young men and women who have just had real trouble breathing.
Sydney had seen nothing like this in 70 years.
I actually thought the whole city is on fire.
I'm 72 years old, and I've never seen that in my life before.
An intense low-pressure system had swept in from central Australia. Gale force winds whipping up dust from lands ravaged by Australia's worst drought on record.
Because the inland parts are so dry, it picked up vast quantities of topsoil, which then got pushed across towards the coast.
By this afternoon, the dust over Sydney was beginning to clear. The sun struggling to break through, the storm powering north towards the city of Brisbane. Ian Williams, NBC News, Bangkok.
In Southern California, state of emergency now in Ventura County after a wildfire that's burned almost 16,000 acres. And of course, as always, the dry, windy weather is making the job of fighting the fire tougher. Hard to tell, but the floodwaters in parts of the south are receding tonight. The toll, however, is growing. Now 9 deaths are reported in northern Georgia. The cost of property damage from this one, over $250 million. That's so far. Officials say many of the buildings hit are not insured. Federal Reserve said today it's keeping its key interest rate at 0 while painting an upbeat picture of the economy. But an acknowledgement that they are winding down their purchases of treasuries and mortgage debt seemed to spook the stock market. The Dow went up more than 80 points to down more than 80 points at the closing bell. All of that in the course of one day's trading. We've reported in the past couple of weeks about a practice that rakes in a lot of money for banks, hitting customers with what can be huge overdraft fees, sometimes for purchases as small as a cup of coffee. Well, today, 3 of this nation's biggest banks announced they are changing those policies. Our report on this tonight from our senior investigative correspondent, Lisa Myers.
In a major reversal, Bank of America says beginning next month, it will finally allow NBC News, Washington.
A lot more to tell you about when we continue along the way on a Wednesday night, including portions of my interview today with the Prime Minister of Great Britain. How special is that special relationship these days?
Sunday, 2 exclusive interviews. Former President Bill Clinton on the challenges facing America, and New York Governor David Paterson, the president's impact on his political future. If it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press with David Gregory.
We're back now, as we mentioned, with a portion of my exclusive interview with British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who is here in New York for the meeting at the UN. For that matter, we'll also see him tomorrow at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh. We sat down to talk not far from where high-level meetings were taking place. The first thing I asked about were reports that he was being snubbed somehow by President Obama on this trip, allegedly over the controversial release of that Lockerbie bomber.
Well, first of all, I met President Obama last night, and we had a long talk about some of the big issues affecting us, and I'll be meeting him in Pittsburgh in a one-to-one meeting, but of course we're meeting all the time. I do say that the special relationship, the relationship between Britain and America is strong. It continues to strengthen.
Relationships soured after the release of the Lockerbie bomber. It was later reported you had said you didn't want to see the man die in prison, though you found his welcome home abhorrent.
My first thoughts were for the relatives of those people who died. I don't forget the day that the Lockerbie bombing happened, and I don't forget the suffering of all the families who have gone through years of pain and years of anguish. So let us be in no doubt. McGravey is regarded by us as the person responsible for the crime. His sentence has not been commuted. He has simply been let out by the Scottish authorities because they believe that he will die within 3 months. Now, I can understand the reaction to that. I can also understand people's feelings about Britain as a result of that. But this was a decision made on legal grounds by the Scottish administration. We could not have done anything about it.
The problem is some of your citizens will forever believe, and a fair number of Americans, that it was the result of a deal, and that deal had to do with oil.
There was no deal. I can give you an absolute and unconditional assurance. There was no deal on oil. There was no deal on anything else. There was no double dealing. There was no conspiracy. There was no prior agreement or anything. And I think we've got to put this in one perspective. Over these last 10 years, we've seen Libya try to move to a better position in the international community by renouncing nuclear weapons and at the same time renouncing any role in international terrorism. Now, we have got to hold Libya to these promises. And these are the issues, security issues, that I will continue to raise with Libya, but no deals. No background, backroom stitch-up of any sort. And I do assure the American people that we would never put them in that position.
Let's talk, Mr. Prime Minister, about Afghanistan. In the Iraq War, the Brits got Basra, a violent, long slog. In Afghanistan, British forces have been concentrated in Helmand Province, a long, violent slog. You've suffered 217 losses there. Will we see a substantial, dramatic reduction in forces, a reorganization on the British side of this fight?
Well, let me say first of all that we have a duty, all of us, a duty to prevent terrorism returning to the streets of New York or returning to the streets of London. The second thing is that the way forward in Afghanistan, even after the disputes about the election, is very clear to me. It's got to be a policy of the Afghan people, their army, their police, taking more responsibility for their own affairs. We are prepared, and always have been, to put the troops that are necessary to make sure that the training and what we call mentoring of the Afghan forces leads to an army by next year of 135,000. Our strategy is Afghanization, as you call it, which is the Afghan people taking more control of their own affairs. That is the way forward for Afghanistan, and that's the key to a safer Britain and a safer America.
Part of our conversation earlier today here in New York with Gordon Brown. It's all on our website tonight. That's nightly.msnbc.com. Still ahead, as our broadcast continues tonight, you perhaps saw his spoof on camera. Well, it delivered a punch. It got the nonprofit group Acorn in big trouble. Now, in an NBC News exclusive, we learn more about who he is and what he's doing behind the camera. Tonight, an NBC News exclusive. In his first broadcast network news interview, the young man behind the candid camera-like spoof that has caused so much backlash against the group Acorn. He tells his story. Acorn has now filed a lawsuit over his hidden camera video that got 2 of its Baltimore office employees fired and touched off a big internal investigation. NBC's Mara Schiavocampo has our story.
This is how most of the world was introduced to James O'Keefe as a young video producer dressed like a pimp for a hidden camera investigation into Acorn, the community advocacy group whose voter registration efforts in disadvantaged communities were targeted by President Obama's opponents last year. And this is how I met him. Yes. As a soft-spoken, self-described radical dealing with an awful lot of new attention.
We think you're unbelievable.
That's caught him completely by surprise. Did you expect? Introduction to the public is the beginning of a long relationship. Mara Schiavocampo, NBC News, New York.
When we come back, a big milestone in the life of Bruce Springsteen. Can you blame the rest of us for thinking maybe we ain't that young anymore? Couple of things here before we go tonight. First, an example of why timing is everything in life. At Fire Station 99 in LA, a group of firefighters had just finished a refresher course on how to deliver a baby when a couple on their way to the hospital, can you guess the rest, pulled into the driveway. They were having a baby. The team swung into action, delivered a healthy baby girl, second child for the couple. Everybody's fine. All the guys on the shift, by the way, insist the baby now has 8 new uncles. Something else we noticed while Muammar Gaddafi was talking at the UN today. Live coverage on 3 cable networks. Just pick your spelling. 3 of them. For the record, the accepted spelling of his name that NBC uses is Khaddafy. And finally tonight, this was a big day in my home state because our #1 citizen turned 60 today. How's that for a marker of time? Bruce Springsteen is 60 years old today, even though the scruffy Born to Run version seems like just yesterday. He's an active 60, working his way through a 9-month, 60-city world tour. He sold 1.5 million tickets so far. He played for over 3 hours just this past weekend in Chicago. Let's also not forget he's the head of a huge organization, what he calls the heart-stopping, pants-dropping, house-rocking, earth-shaking, booty-quaking, Viagra-taking, love-making E Street Band. Happy birthday, boss. That's our broadcast for this Wednesday night. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams. We hope to see you right back here tomorrow evening. Good night.
NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams, winner of 3 Emmy Awards, more than any other evening news broadcast. Most watched, most honored. NBC News.